What up, y'all? I'm Dr. CBS here with Dr. Jared Ball, and you're tuned into episode 8 of The Last Dope Intellectual.
So for this special edition of Shoot the Shit, Dr. CBS, I wanted to sort of hijack the introduction of it because I wanted to ask you about your recent event, the Tamament event you did with Dr. Robin D.G. Kelley, and ask you about it because I thought it was fascinating and something that deserves a little bit of follow-up. So I hope you don't mind. I would like to jump off with that to shoot the shit with you about that on this one.
I do not mind. And then I'm going to hijack what you usually do and say, but first, what's on your shirt? For me, I got Dr. You can't even see it, Dr. Walter Rodney, which I will talk about later on in the show, but that is the Walter Rodney Foundation t-shirt. So what you got?
I got, this is, I call it my Pan-African, my Prince Pan-African shirt. My purple badness, the fist and the continent. So I couldn't quite get, I don't have a Rodney shirt, to be honest. So I tried to get one that represented, something symbolically of what obviously he represents to many of us. So
yeah, dope.
The Black Power fist coming out of the continent with a little shout out to the late, great Prince as well. So anyway.
Okay. All right. So continue.
So first of all, if folks haven't seen this discussion, we'll put the link in the description to this edition of The Last Dope Intellectual, because people really should check out this discussion you had with Dr. Kelley. And my first question that I wanted to just ask you to wrap a little bit about is does your forthcoming book, Black Scare, Red Scare, deal any more with what you've written elsewhere about the specific intellectual McCarthyism within Black studies or movements, that is Black studies or Black movements historically and today? That is, to what extent is there a Red Scare within Black struggles? Because when I watch you talk about this and in this discussion and the subject matter in general, it is kind of a stark reminder, for me at least, to the extent to which these discussions seem, if not fully absent, suppressed within certain segments of Black studies. So I'm just wondering, from your vantage point, and do you discuss that more in your forthcoming work?
Well, I would say in this forthcoming work, Black Scare, Red Scare, I address it indirectly through my own archival usage, right? That is to say, there'll be a section in the introduction where I talk about why it is specifically that I focus on Black communists. And in that sort of segment, I'll talk about why it is I draw on this archive, what they have to offer, and why it is that we don't know more about them and that we don't have the type of analysis that they have. And it's because of intellectual McCarthyism. But I am in conversation with another press for my second book already called Epistemologies of Blackness, in which I deal directly with intellectual McCarthyism and and anti-Marxism and the evasion of political economy in Black studies through 4 hegemonic discourses. Interestingly, I think I talked about this before. I actually started writing that book first when I was on my postdoc at University of Illinois. It was under contract with another press. I got out of that contract and now I'm in conversation with another press. They already are like, okay, we want to publish this book. And so I go into it directly into the sort of epistemological dimensions of the Black Scare and Red Scare in that book. So.
All right, right on. I look forward to that for sure. The other thing I want to ask you about is just how dominant is, or should we make, the narrative within of U.S. history, that is the narrative of U.S. history, about what you and Dr. Kelley describe as anti-communism being a driver of policy or an ideological driver of public policy in this country? To what extent should that be the theme we use or lens we use to understand this country's history?
I think that we definitely need to pay much, much more attention to it. I think Gerald Horne does it in various ways in his work. But part of the upshot of that is that anti-communism is just the more recent enunciation of a broader history, a much longer history I date back elsewhere to the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. But it's this broader history of anti-radicalism. But anti-communism just becomes, let us say, a metonym or a synecdoche for this broader history of anti-radicalism. That is to say, it's anti-communism describes all sorts of sort of state anxieties about, internationalism, anti-colonialism, Black liberation, anti-capitalism, socialism, anarchism, etc. And so I think that when we look at the law, right, the law in these different legislations that are passed, we need to look at it very carefully for like, what are the ways in which this is meant to regulate or to stymie more radical or redistributive or counter-hegemonic efforts. Like, it seems to me that the legislation that's passed in this country is always a means of co-optation. It's meant to take only the most palpable aspects of what radical movements are struggling for and then incorporate those into the status quo. And that's an anti-radicalizing move. And I think that that's the role of the state, because the state is constitutively anti-radical and anti-Black. So all of that to say, I think we can use anti-communism as a way to look for other forms of proto-fascism or other forms of anti-radicalizing tendencies, like anti-terrorism, for example, which is a contemporary manifestation. So I think it's a really, really, really important lens, and like, it would do well for us Black folks to pay attention to that as well, so we can stop red baiting and we can stop having this weird anti-communism. And to clarify, I don't think everybody should be a communist if they don't want to be. But certainly everybody should avoid anti-communism. And there's a distinct difference, right? Because as many of the thinkers that I know point out, like, anti-communism, first of all, is weaponized against Black people. And secondly, it's a means of shutting down all civil rights and liberties. And again, because our, Black people shit is already tenuous at best, we would do well not to align with state structures that make it even harder for us to struggle and do what we need to do.
Well, I think for me, one of the biggest concerns and why I wanted to ask at least these little questions in this brief segment is that, to your point, I've never advocated that anybody become a communist, but I am increasingly becoming aware to the extent to which so many great Black women and men have engaged Marxist, Leninism, communist, socialist struggles to advance the struggles of Black people here and around the world that are not included enough in the discussions by Black people when we are considering today what to do. Period. And that's the part that's frustrating to me. So that's why I wanted to just raise that up. The last piece, there's so many more things. And again, people really need to watch this conversation and the presentation you offer that leads to the conversation with Dr. Kelly. But the last thing I wanted to just raise is admittedly is somewhat of a touchy subject, which is, how do people who focus on these histories and these analyses apply them in sort of practical political decision making in their own lives? So specifically, I keep thinking about what we are supposed to do with the vote. So I'm just wondering, how, in other words, so I know that like people like Dr. Kelly and other prominent intellectuals ultimately support, in many cases, voting for the lesser of evils in the Democratic Party. And I'm just wondering, I don't know. I disagree with that, number one, but I just wonder what maybe these histories inform, or maybe how do you think people like Dr. Kelly or others who study these histories are reaching those conclusions? Like, what are in these histories that you focus on so much, maybe lead people to reach those conclusions or inform those decisions? Maybe are there traditions within the Black left that you can point to? In fact, I know that there are, but that you can maybe raise up briefly here to talk about why someone would say, I want us to move towards a radical left, but also we have to vote in terms of electoral politics in these ways.
Well, I'm going to respond to this question and not answer it. I'm going to respond to it obliquely, but it reminds me of like the debate around the Black Belt Nation thesis. Like, people like Harry Haywood and Claudia Jones supported the Black Belt Nation thesis, but then there were other Black communists like Otto Weiswood who did not. And part of what they were arguing is that Black people do not constitute a separate nation, that what Black people actually want in their actual historical and material experience attests that they want full political and economic and social rights within the nation itself. So they want full integration. And to me, and that debate is important because full integration will require a particular electoral political participation that people like, that many of our radicals advocate. So, right. So lesser of two evilism. And generally speaking, their argument is that there's more possibility under a particular regime. So there's more possibility and more ability to stop the bleeding, so to speak, under, let us say, a Biden as opposed to a Trump. What becomes really difficult is because of the ways in which we bifurcate domestic and foreign policy. If you look at the foreign policy is generally exactly the same. There's generally a continuation from administration to administration, but what can change is like, are we going to let LGBTQ people in the military, which matters? Are we going to, overtly tell the Proud Boys to stand down and stand by or what have you? But what I disagree with, especially in this moment, is that we have to understand actually existing history. So this idea that now that Trump is out of office, the fascist threat has abated, that's bullshit. Because just because Trump is out of office doesn't mean that now the fascists are like, all right, y'all, well, we lost, let's pack up and go home. We know, like, that's absurd. And what it means is that they are extremely organized. They're going to continue to organize. They're going to continue to do what they want to do under whatever regime. And so this idea that they only feel empowered because somebody who thinks like them was in office, I think that is ahistorical, and that doesn't, and it especially doesn't reflect our current moment, because, what was it? 70, 74, 78 million people voted for that person. Just because they lost, all of a sudden they're going to be like, guess we're progressive now, or guess we're liberal now. No, like that's absurd. And if anything, they're going to continue to be on their platforms like Parler or whatever and continue to mobilize. And so, and it's also a top-down perspective, right? Because people are going to organize or they're not, regardless. And there is one might be other perspective that the Democrats being in office is a mollification moment where people feel like we don't need to struggle as much because Trump is out of office, which is a different type of problematic than the brute repression that would accompany a second Trump regime. But as we see in Kentucky, for example, they're already criminalizing protests under Biden. So that's the other thing, too, is that we have massive states' rights in this country, whereby the states do whatever the fuck they want, irrespective. Look at all the voter repression laws that are being passed through these state legislatures. Like, so I think we have to have a better analysis than that, and really understand the duopolistic nature of our government, and not think that a Republican versus a Democrat makes a whole lot of difference. But to make a short story long, and to go back to the question that you asked, I think there are tendencies even within the Black radical left that did have a perspective that there is some sort of electoral participation. But I will say that these people also ran third-party candidates, whether it was through the Progressive Party, whether it was through the Communist Party, whether it was through through the Socialist Party or whatever. They also ran third-party candidates. So I don't know.
Right on. Well, listen, the only other thing I would want to say is I really hope people go and watch this conversation, if for no other reason, when you make a reference to class Schadenfreude, which is, again, one of my favorite words in world language, Schadenfreude. It will inform people's understanding, I think, even further of so many of these segments you've already hosted on this platform and on the show, and even that we're going to get into later in this very program. So it was a great conversation to watch and presentation that you started off with. So I encourage people to check it out. And as far as I'm concerned, thank you very much. That is our segment of Shoot the Shit this week.
Period. Next segment. Ready? All right, y'all. So for the next segment, I'm going to focus on In Review, which again is a segment in which I review text, that is books, articles, blog posts, documents, or whatever else strikes my fancy that I've been thinking with or thinking about at the moment. And of course, right now I am thinking about Walter Anthony Rodney. You can't see him because my microphone's in the way, but that is who's on my shirt, as I mentioned earlier. And he is top of mind for two reasons. Number one, his birthday was March 23rd. He would have been 79 if he had not been assassinated by the Burnham regime on June 13th, 1980, Friday the 13th, which is really wild. So that's one reason. And also, I just want to mention that his daughter, Asha Rodney, his youngest daughter, her birthday is March 22nd. So shout out to Asha Rodney, one on the board of the directors for the Walter Rodney Foundation. And the second reason is because the 18th annual Walter Rodney Symposium just happened this past Sunday. And it included my own participation as well as a keynote by Angela Davis. A bunch of BAP comrades participated, Erica Keynes, DURÉE Buhill, who set it all the way off. Y'all, once that recording is available, you have to watch because DURÉE was not playing. Okay, DURÉE was the star of that show, hands down. We also had Ajamu Baraka, the homie Nick Estes. So it was a whole bunch of stuff. We had a video from Donald Rodney, who was the brother of Walter Rodney, who also was convicted. He was convicted after his assassination for ostensibly participating. So part of the struggle of the Walter Rodney Foundation to clear the name of, or to get justice for Walter Rodney, that is to hold the PNC and the Burnham regime accountable for their direct role in his assassination. Part of that struggle was also to clear the name of Donald Rodney, who still has a conviction as a participant in Rodney's murder. So part of what I want to do is talk about, number one, it's my show. So I want to talk about a piece that I wrote in 2019 about Walter Rodney for the African American Intellectual History Society that was called Between Radicalism and Repression, Walter Rodney's Revolutionary Praxis. And actually, this particular piece was based on a lecture I gave for the Walter Rodney Foundation lecture series that year in 2019. And essentially, I just write about the ways in which Walter Rodney is sort of a consummate radical, and also how that type of Pan-African revolutionary Black liberationist radicalism elicits state repression. And so I just want to read a couple of sections from that particular blog post, and I encourage you all to check it out. It's not very long. I start off the piece by saying, on June 13th, 1980, the Black Marxist Pan-Africanist historian and scholar activist Walter Rodney was assassinated in Georgetown, Guyana. That year, students and faculty at the University of Dar es Salaam, where he taught for 8 years, demanded the university confer upon him a posthumous honorary degree. They insisted that his dedication to the cause of third world liberation, his support for freedom struggles in Southern Africa against Portuguese colonialism and white supremacist regimes, his immense contribution to transforming the university into a progressive institution, his unparalleled intellectual work excavating the impact of enslavement, colonialism, and imperialist oppression on African people, and his struggle against the repressive and tyrannical Burnham regime, among many other contributions, made him ideally suited for such an honor. And so that petition was in the Walter Rodney paper. So in this particular piece and in that lecture that I gave, I drew upon a bunch of documents, unpublished documents that are in the Walter Rodney papers at the Woodruff Library at the AUC. I think that that's important because he has, a body of scholarship, but there's also a bunch of stuff that nobody really knows about because it's in his papers that Patricia Rodney deposited at the Woodruff Library at the AUC. So I very much encourage people to go check out those papers. But anyway, the importance of that particular document was that, they are showing how Walter Rodney is not only important to their institution and not only important to the struggle on the African continent, but he has Pan-African resonance. And also in that statement, they condemned the Burnham regime for its role in assassinating Dr. Rodney. So I go on to talk about, I write, some of Rodney's most important contributions to the Black liberation movement were his explication of and mobilization against oppression and exploitation, emanating from the interrelationships of imperialism, neocolonialism, and white supremacy. He understood colonialism to be a form of political rule that was one facet of the larger imperial process. On the African continent, colonial rule reflected deeper forces of domination and dispossession that fundamentally transformed the mode of production and social relations therein. Neocolonialism, by contrast, was the reality that when freedom from, quote, white man's rule had ostensibly been achieved, the material conditions of most Africans did not radically alter, the cultural conditions were not significantly transformed, and the political and social structures were transitioned from the possession of one ruling class to another. So, I also talked about this a little bit in my talk that I gave at the 18th annual Walter Rodney Symposium that just passed. But his analysis is so important because he's linking all of the structures of domination that result in the reproduction of not only racial hierarchy, but also capitalist exploitation. And if you've read my work, I have this very particular definition of racial capitalism. And in my perspective, Walter Rodney is a very early theorist of racial capitalism because of the ways in which he's bringing together all of these sort of structures of domination that are at the intersection of oppression and exploitation, but analyzing them in their particular, the ways in which they work on the African continent and also in the Caribbean and also in Guyana, but he also pays particular attention to the comprador class or the African or Caribbean petty bourgeoisie, which is really, really, really important because he's pointing out the class dynamics in the post-colonial situation. And I think that that's something that we need to continue to do in our moment. So I end by saying, like W.E.B. Du Bois, Claudia Jones, William Patterson, and many other Black revolutionaries, Rodney was punished for his radicalism. In 1968, he was refused re-entry into Jamaica for ostensibly attempting to spread Castro-style revolution, precipitating what came to be known as the Rodney riots. In 1974, his appointment to the University of Guyana was canceled, and in September 1979, he was arrested and accused, along with other WPA members, of burning down the People's National Congress headquarters. His home was ransacked by government officials, and political literature was confiscated. He was also banned from international travel while he awaited trial. Rodney's assassination in 1980 underscored the fundamental threat, his love for African people, his push for the end of imperialism, his analysis of neo-colonialism, and his belief in socialism opposed to U.S. domination, Western hegemony, and global South leaders committed to perpetuating a racist imperialist capitalism. Now, the next thing that I want to lift up in relationship to his 1979 indictment for burning down the PNC headquarters relates to a speech he gave called The Struggle Goes On in September 1979. And this speech actually addressed the murder of Father Bernard Drake on July 14th of 1979 that year. And that murder relates to Rodney's case because Drake was there photographing the WPA, the Working People's Alliance, picket in response to the trumped up charges against Walter Rodney, Rupert Roopnarine, and Omowale. And then Father Bernard Drake was killed by members of the House of Israel, which is kind of like it was this paramilitary force that ironically was largely made up of African Americans. And they were kind of like, they were a manifestation of like PNC thuggery, basically, as Rodney describes it. And so this speech is important because he's describing a lot of these sort of post-colonial, neo-colonial dynamics that shaped ultimately the conditions for his assassination. So I just want to read this one part called The Burnham Touch from that speech. Also, just because Walter Rodney was dope, he not only wrote deeply researched, amazingly rigorous, amazingly insightful works like How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, like History of the Upper Guinea Coast, like, A History of the Guyanese Working People. But he also he gave amazing speeches. And so I just want to read, and he was, funny and dope. So I just want to read a little bit of this speech. So he said, when one is searching for words to describe what is going on, it is very difficult to find the appropriate terms. Personally, as the days go by, I find it difficult to describe the reality around us. Although I would modestly say that my vocabulary is not limited, I find my choice of words limited to those which describe excrement, words which have to do with the feces and defecation. One has to come down to speak of it in a way that reflects and captures the reality of the time and the mood of the people. The other evening, speaking at another site, I had to draw the analogy to say, what if there ever was a such thing called the Midas touch, which was the touch that made everything turn into gold? Then we will have to say a new creation in this society, the Burnham touch, where everything he touches turns to shit. One has to put it in these brutal terms because the situation in which we are is a brutal situation. One has to put it in these crude terms because they have reduced us in such a way that even those terms do not fully capture reality. Whatever they touch, even if they touch a policeman in uniform, this is the Burnham touch. And that is why we speak to our brothers in uniform, and we have to greet them roughly, not because we do not understand they are brothers and sisters in uniform, but because we have to point out to them the way in which they have been touched and that they're covered with filth because of this regime. They continually have to go out and do all the manner of dirty work. Now, there's so much there that is also relevant to our moment, right? And not only with Trump. So Trump definitely had that reverse Midas touch where everything he touched turned to shit. But Biden is doing, it's like shit and diarrhea, maybe. This is really gross, getting really gross. But anyway, he also has a particular critique of the police, right? And the ways in which the police are essentially occupying forces and they're doing the dirty work of the Burnham regime. And so anyway, I just liked, how he broke it down and put it in a way that was like humorous, but that also showed the sort of the pervasive corruption and degradation of that society. And I think that we also need to be able to make it plain and make it clear, especially those of us who are academics, but who also want to be able to speak beyond the ebony tower, so to speak. We need to be able to make it plain and make it clear. And I just feel like not only that section in the speech, but that speech as a whole conveys just, Rodney's amazingness, basically. And not only that, the fact that he's speaking out about his comrade, even as he's being subjected to a bunch of repression and he, is facing imprisonment, he is making a speech about his comrade and his friend. And it just goes to show, what I call mutual comradeship, but it also just goes to show the type of person that Walter Rodney was. The next thing that I want to lift up is actually probably my favorite book that's kind of by Walter Rodney, but also about him. It's called Walter Rodney Speaks. And this book is based on an interview he did in 1974 at the Institute of the Black World. And they transcribed those speeches and they turned it into this book, Walter Rodney Speaks. And there is a particular section in Walter Rodney Speaks that I think is really important. It was really important to my own sort of intellectual development about how we as Black people need to engage Marxism, right? So I know I'm reading a lot, y'all, and my reading on camera is actually really trash, but I don't care. Y'all know what I'm saying. So this is it's between pages 100 and 102 in Walter Rodney Speaks for those who have this work. Oh, it matches my shirt. Okay. So he said, in the process of study, it is equally important that one should not merely study the classic Marxist texts. Marxism is not just a study of some classic text written for some other situation. We should enter into the spirit of the analysis and be capable of applying it creatively to our own situation. Actually, here again, saying that is not particularly new. Marxist theorists and even some of the youngsters today, we will say, we want to be Marxists or we're Marxists, and we will apply Marxism to our own objective conditions. The statement can be trotted out, but in practice, very few of these individuals are engaged in the kind of work that is necessary for the application of scientific theory to our own society. Very few of them have an awareness of how misleading it can be to take an understanding of someone else's theory and just imagine that it can be projected onto your situation. For sure, I believe that those socialists within the nationalist movement in the third world are usually the ones who have a greater capacity to carry out nationalist objectives than the so-called nationalists. But that aside, some of the people who call themselves nationalists, the conservative sector of the nationalist movement, can make a great deal of propaganda capital, polemical capital, out of the fact that these Marxist individuals are not deeply relating to the local internal situation. And because they don't relate to it, because they merely bring to it the thread of someone else's history, when they actually make a statement about what is going on in the United States or what is to be done, it can actually sound rather ludicrous. And not just fails to convince people, but it can be self-evidently absurd because it just does not address any part of the reality in that society. He goes on to give an example. Then he says, it's our responsibility to avoid falling into that kind of trap. But again, I don't think I could say to the nationalists, please be cool and understand that the brother is just entering into the discipline. He will get around to applying it to society and so on. The reason is that it may not be in the class interest of the particular person who calls himself a nationalist. But when you're working amongst Black people, a vast majority of whom are potentially capable of internationalizing a socialist ideology, we must assume that the responsibility is ours to demonstrate its relevance. he say, we need to be far more careful to avoid alienating people by even seeming to be, and very often actually being, the bringers of an alien analysis, or not even analysis, since the example I've been referring to is a non-analysis. It's really a fixed position substituting for an analysis of society. He goes on to say, I believe that our history imposes upon a Black Marxist the necessity to operate almost exclusively, certainly essentially, within the Black community. Now I know that will be likely to sound heretical to many Marxists, because they will say, but surely your constituency is the working class. You should therefore transcend rather than be a prisoner of the racial divisions within the class, because these racial divisions are essentially divisions at the subjective level of consciousness. This is how the traditional argument will go, but I'm not at all convinced about that. They might be right, but I find it rather peculiar, and I believe that a number of mistaken strategies derive from taking the racial divisions merely as subjective, and therefore as something that you break down merely by speaking to the white worker and by exposing him to a superior logic. I believe that superior logic works only where there is no rooted class interest. So that is why, y'all, I identify as a Rodneyist, because as you see, what he's saying is, number one, it's not about mastering some obscure Marxist text. It's about taking Marxism or scientific socialism and applying it to our historical and material conditions, our own situation. And that Black Marxists, or Rodneyists, as I identify as, we must apply it to our own Black communities, right? And we must understand it in the context of our own Black communities. And so he's taking racial division as granted, and he's taking the realities of racial division and saying that, number one, the way in which we ought to understand it is with a class analysis. And also, but that the point of that class analysis is not to speak to white workers and to convince them that they shouldn't be racist anymore, but to talk to our own people so we can reveal the contradictions within our own communities and in our own society because of the special character of Black people as a working people. That's my interpretation anyway. And so I just think that that's amazing. And I think that that is my orientation to and my agreement with scientific socialism as an approach, but not as dogmatism, right? Just as a tool to understand, how we're going to get free. The last thing I want to do is talk about the Walter Rodney Foundation, and just turn y'all's attention to the website, which is WalterRodneyFoundation.org. And I invite you all to check that out, to donate, and to get to know that foundation. They do a number of events. Part of the purpose of the Walter Rodney Foundation is to keep Walter Rodney's legacy alive, not just in our minds, but also to continue on the type of work that he was interested in doing and that he was committed to as a scholar, organizer, activist, revolutionary. Last thing I'll say is that I want to lift up Patricia Rodney, Asha Rodney, Kanini Rodney, and Shaka Rodney, because the Kanini, Shaka, and Asha are his children, and they are also instrumental in the Walter Rodney Foundation. And then, of course, Patricia Rodney, as I spoke about at the Walter Rodney Symposium, she is an intellectual in her own right. She has her book. It's right here. Let me just pull it out. It's this book, The Caribbean State, Healthcare and Women, an Analysis of Barbados and Grenada. She also has a number of articles, single-authored and co-authored articles about different issues at the intersection of public health, race, and the postcolonial state. She's important as well. And I feel like because she's the widow of Walter Rodney, she gets overlooked and only engaged as the widow of Walter Rodney or as the keeper of his legacy, which is important. But she's also a scholar and a practitioner and a freedom fighter in her own right. So definitely check out her work as well. So there's so much more to be said about Walter Rodney. I love him. I am learning from him all the time. He's one of my greatest teachers, as well as Mama Patricia Rodney. So get into it. And, you might become a Rodneyist too. All right, y'all. So now we're going to do the segment Discourse and That Course. And if you recall, essentially what we're going to do is present two sides of a dominant argument. And so Jared and I are going to do this a little bit differently today. Essentially, we're going to engage this interview by Ras Baraka, who is the mayor of Newark. And he was on a show called All Politics Are Local, where essentially he's weighing in not only on the Tamika Mallory and Samaria Rice situation, but also the ways in which we as Black folks ought to distinguish between our friends and enemies, but also the approach we should take to sort of organizing and to caring for our communities, right? And so on the one hand, so he's part of what I would say is the dominant discourse, saying we need to be pragmatic and have a united front against racial oppression, against the manifold struggles our people face. Fair enough. Jared and I are in the DAC course where we say, all of that notwithstanding, we need to take a radical approach to pointing out the contradictions within these processes, and that when people are showing themselves to be grifters and showing themselves maybe not to be enemies, but certainly not friends of our communities, we do need to call that out. And we do need to prioritize radical, revolutionary, grassroots struggle and ideology over and above this whole closed ranks ideology, period. Jared, do you want to add on to that?
Only to say that I have always struggled with this idea that somehow critique is a sign of disunity. So I don't. Yeah.
So what we're gonna do is we're gonna play this interview and then pause when necessary to offer up our own perspectives, and then offer up our own perspectives at the end. So here it is. Let's get it, Jared.
With the police all the time in the COINTELPRO and all that stuff that happened, they understood the necessity for basic programs, feeding programs, clothing programs.
And he's talking about Black elected local leadership.
It's necessary. It's
That's
absolutely
right.
Positively 100% necessary, which is why, in city government and folks like that, people want to know why they following elected officials, why they doing this, because they're feeding them. They're giving them jobs. They're providing them people's opportunity. They have,
Can we pause it for a second?
Absolutely.
Need it.
Especially because that's a bare minimum, right?
It's not only that that's a bare minimum, but let's not also negate the fact that people are being berated, right? First of all, people are being convinced that this is the only way to improve their structural and material conditions. And they're also being vote shamed and vote bullied. That's why they begin to think that elected officials are the only people who can resolve their issues. And because grassroots organizing and radical organizing is vilified. So let me just offer that.
The elected officials promote themselves and convince people to vote for them on the basis that they will provide and will be in position to provide all of those services. So I don't understand. So yeah, of course. Anyway.
Period. And if we look all around us, the last thing I just want to say is that if we look all around us, look at Lori Lightfoot. What services are being provided and rendered? Even if we look at Jackson, Mississippi, which is a progressive place, when all those pipes froze, there was a limit to what could be provided without making very deep, very sort of detrimental concessions. So we'll just have to see how that situation plays out. But anyway, they ain't got no magic wand. So
become loyal to folks when those things happen because they need that. And we have to understand that and figure out how to be able to provide the necessities and at the same time try to change the cultural, what's happening culturally and what people are thinking ideologically at the same time. And we try to separate the two, and you can't separate the two.
Right.
And then you wind up fighting each other. And that's that's the whole thing. I think around this Tamika Mallory thing, right? So. I can dig that
excellent segue.
The parents and the other people are upset. You know what I mean? They have a right to be upset, right? These people are upset. They want justice for their children and other things that happen, and it has not happened at the speed, at the rate, sometimes not at all that they want. But that's not Tamika Mallory's fault. That's the
Can we pause it for a second?
That's such a straw argument. Yeah, please go ahead.
It is grinding my gears that people keep reducing Samaria Rice and Lisa Simpson's critique to the fact that they have not gotten justice, and that is the only venue through which they can be upset. They are mad about the activist aristocracy pimping the movement for fame, for money, and for popularity in ways that are not in any way impacting the lived realities of the people whose name these struggles are being waged in. That is what the argument is, and they're evading that altogether. They're making it seem like they just mad over the fact that they haven't gotten justice. Yes, they are righteously angry about that, but they're also angry at the grift of it all. So I don't see why that's being avoided.
I mean, but first of all, but go back to even to the other point. Why should we gloss over the fact that Samaria Rice and other parents are righteously mad at the fact that their children are murdered or killed by police, and the elected officials that promise to provide and produce results for the people in return for their vote haven't been able to do enough, have clearly been insufficient in all of their responses to all of these murders. So this idea again that we should be patient, etc., in the face of this continued violence, in particular when one has suffered it directly as Ms. Rice, it's such to me, again, it's a straw argument to say we have to be patient and allow the elected officials and the institutions to handle the business, when in fact that's why people are upset, because you haven't.
We only need to look at the Lance Bottoms of the world and the Bowsers of the world and the Lightfoots of the world to see the limits of that argument. And this is not only to pick on the Black women mayors, but those are just the ones that immediately come to mind, because in the context of the George Floyd stuff, they did not side with the people that voted for them, period. So
all right,
Constitution's fault that stuff didn't happen, right? They don't want it to happen. She's trying to force these things to happen.
By the way, and I'm sorry, on some level there is or there has to be room for a critique of the work of people like Tamika Mallory and others, where I think it could be argued that they are unwittingly or otherwise inhibiting a faster progress because they do take softer political positions or represent more neoliberal politics and operate as a blunt force against more radical formations and analyses and perspectives, etc. So,
and what they're representing, to your point, what they're representing is this leadership model that is always thrust on Black people, that is rooted in a deep mistrust of the people, that we always need leaders. We always need somebody to distill, to translate the information, to be a go-between between the people and the ruling class. We don't need that shit. And what results more often than not is self-enrichment and self-aggrandizement, period. So
and our anger gets misplaced, right? And so we wind up trying to attack the people who are fighting the same system you're fighting, but the results are not as quick as you thought that they should be or could be. And everybody has a different role in this thing, you know? So we gotta make our ideas mainstream. You have to make it, you have to. What does that mean? That means that with the regular working families, when they listen to you, they have to say, I agree with that. That this is what we should be doing, and begin to push.
But this is happening. This is nonsense.
Ideas.
First of all, 75% of the people in this country want universal health care, and no politician seems to want to advocate that. No, everybody in the community wants an end to police violence. Yet we seem not to be able to get a political platform that addresses that. So I don't understand, what is this argument that what has to be mainstreamed as it relates to this issue, that in terms of what Samaria Rice is advocating? What has to be mainstreamed that requires a Tamika Mallory and a Grammy performance to do it? Anyway.
And again, back to my other point, why is it that the niggerati has to do the mainstreaming?
Right.
Ideas that were once fringe ideas. I mean, even Bernie Sanders running as a socialist.
This is my
right
favorite
now,
bullshit right here.
There was a point in America you couldn't even come outside and say you were a socialist.
That's right.
Lock your behind up.
That's right.
You couldn't even do that.
That's
so
right.
to mainstream those ideas are important. You have to have people to mainstream those ideas.
I feel like he's forgetting the own history of his own father. What are you talking about?
Like, people were getting arrested, losing their jobs, families broken up, deported, for people believing that they were a part of not These people weren't even socialists. They were doing things that were deemed socialists, right? And they weren't part of no socialist or communist organizations. They were doing things that were deemed that and were being attacked. Now a person can run for president of the United States as a socialist, you know, in a major party. That's huge. And
that's ridiculous, and that's not even what happened.
The mainstreaming of ideas, and people like Tamika Mallory and Until Freedom and all of those folks, they're public. They're making people contend with these ideas and contend the whole concept of defund the police and all this other stuff. They're trying to mainstream those ideas. They're trying to put that stuff out there. It doesn't mean because they protest, because they march, because they do all these things that the system is going to fall down tomorrow and give you everything that you need. This thing is protracted.
That's right.
It takes a long period of time, and you have to have the wherewithal to deal with it. And some people get wiped out and hurt. Yeah, you have to have the wherewithal. And people that support that kind of division, it's not good. You can't have people getting on and egging that on.
Let's stop it right there. Why is it that the people who critique are the ones who are we're responsible as the ones sowing division? Why isn't it the people who are inserting themselves as the spoke people? Why isn't it that they who are sowing division, when indeed they're putting themselves above the mass struggle? Like, why is it always when we call it out, oh, that's the division? Why isn't it that the division is when you form a fucking LLC or a 501c3 and you chase one crisis or one murder to the next? Why isn't that sowing division? Because what it's doing is it's turning a broad-based persistent movement into one that lurches from one case and one calamity to another. It's individualizing or sort of segmenting what could be a broader struggle if people wouldn't constantly insert themselves to quote unquote speak truth to power, to put on Brianna-cons when people are already doing other shit. People are trying to build these broad-based coalitions on the ground. People are trying to build out policy and legislation. But what happens is these people who have the stamp of Oprah or a fucking Al Sharpton or a whomever come to parachute down the Ice Cubes of the world, so to speak, and come up with their own plans, not in consultation with anybody else. So why isn't that the division that's being sowed?
Yeah, that argument doesn't hold at all with anyone in communication with actual grassroots activism and politics. Because just for instance, here in Maryland, when I talk to Larry Stafford of Progressive Maryland or leaders of Beautiful Struggle like Lawrence Grand Prix, just to the issue that Ras Baraka is talking about here, their argument is the popularization and the neoliberalization and the co-optation of the issue of defund the police is causing them problems on the ground with the work that they're trying to do with the people that they within their communities, where there is a majority support already for wild and more radical approaches to policing in the community. Then I think Ras Baraka and others like you're suggesting, who are inserting themselves in between the mass struggle and the power structure, are allowing for. So again, it's unfortunately just a series of straw arguments that get laid out here, even to this idea that Bernie Sanders has somehow paved the way for socialist discourse, which I think is absurd.
Yeah, be against Tamika Mallory. Tamika Mallory ain't shoot your child.
Right.
Right. She's not.
That was fucking tacky.
That was tacky.
Having a
low blow.
Social, political, and economic benefit from the death of your children.
It's also another straw argument.
We have to be able to be astute enough to understand that and
can you pause it?
And divide that up. And
yeah, because he's setting up a false dichotomy the implication of what he said is that these mothers are not they're more mad at Tamika Mallory than the people who murdered their children. No, they're not. And they could be mad at both. We can walk and chew gum at the same time.
I could be mad at a whole rack of people at once.
Period. I'm mad at him and that shirt. I'm just playing. Anyway, keep going.
And give our people the information that they need so they can understand who their real enemies are, and not mistake their friends for their enemies,
Right.
right? Or destroy their allies. Because our problem is we do a very good job at isolating ourselves and pushing our allies away, and then we wind up fighting the fight by ourselves, and then we want to know why we isolated and why our enemies always win, because you done pushed all the people who could help you away.
That's why.
Let's stop here. I want to ask you a question, Jared.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing that I want to know is that during World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies. Immediately, the ink had not dried after, the peace accords. And that allyship deteriorated rapidly. And the Soviet Union immediately became an enemy again. So this whole idea of allyship is something, I just want to throw that out there. Secondly, so what I want to ask you, Jared, is there any middle ground between enemies and friends, or is one simply an enemy or a friend? Is there any middle ground in between those poles? So what I'm saying is that are only two options enemies and friends? Can somebody just not be your friend and not your enemy, but not have your interest in mind at all? Like,
yeah,
so I feel like if just because somebody is not an enemy doesn't make them a friend. And just because somebody is not a friend doesn't make them an enemy.
That's right. That's right.
So he's making it seem as if we don't embrace Tamika Mallory wholeheartedly, we're turning her into an enemy.
That's right.
Right? And even if there was some expletives put out there, fine, but that still doesn't make her an enemy. And I just again, it's this sort of Manichaean good and evil logic where it's like, that's not actually what's at play here. And this is just a quintessential class evasion. This is exactly the type of shit that the ruling class does to evade any type of critique. That it's like, we're on your side. We're not your enemy. And when you call us out, number one, you're not critiquing the real enemy, which is not true. And number two, you're alienating yourself from people who are actually on your side.
Which to me means he's also saying the reverse, that while he may be saying to Miss Rice, Tamika Mallory's not your enemy, to me, he's saying that Miss Rice and those who share that criticism are an enemy of those in the class position of Mallory and Baraka and others, which is why he can then say, when you take that position, you create an enemy relationship and you find yourself standing alone, because I'm not going to come and support you after you've been critical of me. I'm not going to support you after you've been critical of my class mates. So I'm going to, you're going to be isolated and left alone. And at no point then does he then, or do they ever have to be critical of the actual ideas and politics and platforms being raised as part of the critique. They can just say, oh, you're critiquing us, we're dismissing you, you are now an enemy and we're going to isolate you. And that to me is more of revealing maybe than anything.
Pushed everybody away. We should take a page out of the, actually the Latino or the Puerto Rican activists who were able to free those Latino and Puerto Rican political prisoners.
Yes.
We need to take a page out of that, because
full-fledged,
not only they had activists on the ground,
right on.
They had their elected officials supporting
them. Yes.
Together. They brought everybody into one tent.
United front all the way. Yes.
They figured out how to bring everybody into one tent.
So, but again, is he then suggesting that Tamika Mallory, that Samaria Rice and those who share that critique are the ones who are not allowing for this political unity to occur to get results? So in other words, where are those that Ras Baraka is saying should be left to do their work in terms of getting the results that Samaria and others are saying should happen? Where is the political equivalent to the Puerto Rican politicians supporting a release of their political prisoners? In other words, Samaria Rice's criticism isn't stopping them. So what is he talking? Anyway,
one of the first early people, Lalila LeBron, was freed in Puerto Rico. I went to her to a church in Harlem that my mother took me to when it was either Harlem or someplace in Manhattan. My mother took me to as a child to see her when she first got out of jail. I tell people that that was the past. But even in the distant past, I mean, in the not too distant past, these folks got political prisoners freed just because of the unity and the strategy that they used to bring everybody under one tent.
I have been arguing with our folks in our circle on that. For look, this is just on that front alone. I've been doing this for over 30 years. Right? Yeah. I have been arguing with our folks about that. I'm the cub they always gets kicked out because I always argue with them. I said, we're keeping this too small. We're missing steps. We got to build you got to do the coalition building. We got to, and this is not rocket science. We come out of the spaces where we've done this already before.
Already.
We were doing it.
So what's that? Okay, so what's
not going to agree with you, man.
Why is it always incumbent upon the marginalized to take the first steps? What is the responsibility of the people who have the most power, the most access, the most privilege, the largest platform to close ranks, not up, but down? What is their responsibility to extend the olive branch without centering themselves and without saying gather around me and holding court, but like actually being like, how can I redistribute all of this shit to help what was already there before I pulled up to the scene? Like, this is wild to me, and it's very
so does this also mean then, for instance, that the National Council of Mayors or whatever that convenes, that they've gotten together and Roz has led an effort among all the national mayors to lead a unified effort to bring redress to the Rice family and to others? Again, that's exactly the point that I'm getting at. Samaria Rice isn't stopping anybody. You and I aren't stopping anybody. We're not stopping them from doing what they say needs to happen.
Have everybody around you who have the same position that you have. They're not going to. There's some things you're not going to agree with people on, and you just have to understand that. We're not together on this, but we could be together on the things we could be together on, right? And we need to be sophisticated enough to actually be together on those things.
Yeah.
Right. And do what we can to move forward, right? And keep pushing our agenda until it becomes more mainstream. And people don't like that word, but and I use it in the term of that it becomes everyday conversation. That's what I mean. When it becomes accepted dialogue, right? And that happens when we put it out there and we put it in the tongues and the mouths of specific people, and we actually affect the superstructure of what's happening, who pushes these ideas on us every day, that we begin to challenge
March into this goofy shit.
I was about to say,
don't use superstructure. Don't use our words. Don't do that. Like, don't do that.
Campaign manager who put the first idea in my head of why you should be run.
Here's what he's talking about, Ron Walters.
He said, if you're not in the conversation, then your ideas don't matter. Like you could be talking about things all you want.
Ron Walters is a great brother too, by the way.
Hold on, let's pause it there. So first of all, what is the conversation? What is the conversation? That's my question. So what do you mean by that? You mean conversation that the ruling elite will accept?
That's it.
Because there are many conversations that are happening all the time. And it's also sometimes, like the game is to be sold, not to be told. We don't want the motherfuckers to know what we're talking about. We don't want them to accept it, because acceptance either means repression or co-optation, period. So this is goofy. But I do want to point to our audience. So recall Ron Walters was the person who wrote the introduction in the first iteration, or the first printing of Alpheus Hunting Unsung Valiant. And Jared had mentioned that what he admired about Ron Walters was that he was no radical, but he recognized his own or his own sort of political position, but didn't red bait and wasn't an anti-communist, and understood the necessity of radical struggle, even as he, as Roz Baraka was pointing out, wanted to be part of the mainstream conversation, I guess. So wasn't on that radical shit.
And I'm glad you point that out, because it's important to in terms of understanding that when Roz is praising Ron Walters and when others are praising Ron Walters, particularly in these spaces, that's what they're referring to. that Walters was able to, he had a seat at the table. Whether or not that meant anything meaningful for the collective is up for debate, but he had a seat at many tables that politicians and those like them want to be placed where they want to be placed. But it again sets limits on I think their analysis and what they advocate be done. So
wherever you at, having a conversation about whatever, right? Talking to your peers about that. But if it's not in the conversation, then it doesn't matter because nobody's arguing the point. Right. So you got to actually get in the debate. Yeah. And that's the point. You got to get yourself in the debate, right? And then make people, because the people who benefit from the debate are the people who are watching it, right? Not the people who are necessarily in it. So people who watched and listened to the things that Bernie Sanders was saying and other folks were saying are begin to see that what he's saying is not as demonic as these people are making it out to believe.
That's right.
That's okay. So I think we get the gist of where he's coming from. I want to say two things about even about his whole debate metaphor. One, Bernie Sanders was in the debate, and the DNC made it so that he could no longer be in the debate. And they did this twice. They did it in 2016 and 2020. So he was at the center of the debate, if you will, or he was one of the key factors. Kamala Harris was not in the debate at all. She was on the stage, but she was polling extremely low, right? Extremely low when it comes to the national conversation. People didn't give a fuck about her position. He's the vice president. So also on his own terms, it's like your shit doesn't hold water, my dude. And also, what is this the debate? Like the fact that the debate is already constituted in his perspective is also a problem because debates are unfolding and happening in different spaces all the time. There is not just one debate that we all need to try to be clamoring to get into. That's very weird.
It's also the debates that they let. It's also that the debates that they quote unquote let anyone into are very limited and preset with their parameters. So the debate again becomes which Democratic Party, which DNC rep do you want to vote for, or which how many drones should be dropped on Syria or Yemen as opposed to none at all. I mean that's the range of debate. So once you get there, okay, cool. I mean, but if for those of us who want the range of debate to include actual re-civilizational work, that debate is never on the docket for discussion. So it's so frustrating, those conversations. In fact, the way we watched it is really the only way I can really tolerate and stomach it. Period.
So this was not just a polemic of me and Jared going off on Ras Baraka and that interview, but it is so discourse and that course is an important segment in my perspective because there is a sort of dominant or mainstream or hegemonic discourse that we do need to engage, but we always need to convey there's the other side to this thing, at least one other side, if not multiple, that need to be engaged, and that it's okay if you in the DAC course. I'm often in the DAC course, period. Because, whatever, maybe, I've been told my politics are for the already converted. Okay. But you're not alone. You're not crazy. We out here. And, we don't have to capitulate to the ruling class niggerati bullshit.
No, and I've always... Yeah. Again, I butcher the quote all the time, but Dr. King said something to the effect that leaders are consensus molders, not followers. So it's always fine to be, I think, in the DAT course. And then the other reason I think it's important to be in the DAT course is because I've always believed philosophically that the goal for those of us in the work that we're doing is to organize the people who already more or less agree on a certain set of principles and ideas. It's not, I think, to go out here and in small pockets try to massively convert everyone. I don't think that that's how movements or radical politics can evolve. I think that's part of the straw argument that gets a lot of people trapped up and caught up in unfortunately this Ras Baraka form of analysis. So.
Because in the final analysis, when it comes to united fronts or when it comes to that unity, it is always the radicals. It's always the left wing that has to capitulate. It's always us that have to give up our principles which tend to be have the most people in mind, which tends to be the most fundamental to transforming this hellscape. But we are the ones that have to be always have to move to the center. And this bears out historically. And it's like, at some point, again, as I say all the time, at some point we have to stop negotiating the terms of our immiseration. So
look, lastly, I just wanted to say, looking up a little bit of Tamika Mallory's Until Freedom group, there were a couple buzzwords in the about section that I think are cause for further concern. Like, for instance, for me, the phrase financial literacy. They do financial literacy training, which is Black capitalism in disguise. And then they describe themselves as having a rapid response to crises that involves bringing a quick response from contacts, faith leaders, and what they engage in as they describe as triage, which I thought, given your conversation with Dr. Strong and the ambulance chasing tree of Al Sharpton, sounds unfortunately consistent. And a bit of a cause for concern. So on some level, we do have to be able to be a united front, but have some sort of critical conversations with one another, and especially about what's being said on behalf of the group by segments of the group. So,
and that very approach just lends to the idea that you're appending yourself to harm and trauma. That is exactly the purpose of your organization. Your rapid response is to lurch from one calamity to another and amplify that, which means that you have no long-term building strategy, because you got your suitcase packed, you ready to hop on a plane, train, or Zoom, I guess, and just hype it up. And that, seems antithetical to many other approaches. All right, y'all. So for this segment of Left Disquisition, which is the time when I'm talking about what's being talked about, discussed, analyzed, commented on, or critiqued on the platforms I learn from, I want to talk about these U.S. out of Haiti campaigns, which is part of the broader movements that are happening actually in Haiti on the ground against the continued regime and dictatorship of Jovenel Moïse. And so, of course, I want to shout out my own organization, Black Alliance for Peace. We have a resources page, Black Alliance for Peace /Haiti. But particularly this weekend, March 27th through 29th is really, really important, because there are actions happening not only all over the country, but also in Haiti and throughout the world, in solidarity with Haitian people on the ground who are continuing to struggle every day, every week, to get Jovenel Moïse out, and more broadly to get the United States, the United Nations, and the Organization of American States out of Haiti, and to cease undermining the self-determination and the autonomy of the Haitian people. And so I'm reading this from our U.S. Out of Haiti Action Weekend page, R being Black Alliance for Peace, where it says March 29th is the anniversary of the 1987 Haitian Constitution, written after the 1986 overthrow of the brutal Jean-Claude Duvalier dictatorship. The 1987 Constitution was designed to create a socially just, economically free, and politically independent Haitian nation. Those ideals are again in crisis. And then the page goes on to speak about how these actions began to pop off in the beginning of February, when Moïse refused to step down at the end of his presidential term, and is now effectively engaged in a dictatorship. And so U.S. out of Haiti is not meant to drown out the actions and the mass mobilization that's happening in Haiti, but to highlight our responsibility in the belly of the beast, to hold the United States accountable for its role in propping up the Moïse regime, and of continuing to turn Haiti into an occupied country year after year. And so there are a multitude of actions that are happening in the United States. And also on that page that I was just reading from, you can click on a link and it will tell you if there is an action happening in your community and on what date. So again, these actions are happening from the 27th to the 29th. So for example, in Chicago, we have our protest at the Haiti consulate on Sunday, March 28th at 11 o'clock a.m. There's one happening in DC. I think theirs is on Monday. So the BAP DC, they have their protest on March 29th. And so I also want to lift up Breakthrough News, and The Punch Out, which is the podcast hosted by Eugene Puryear. They're actually on the ground in Haiti right now, speaking to people, speaking to organizations and movements that are currently engaged in struggle. And so follow at BT Newsroom on social media in order to get those interviews and to get a firsthand look of what's happening on the ground in Haiti. And then Code Pink, the peace organization Code Pink, are doing a video series where they are lifting up the voices of Haitian women, and their analysis and their perspective of what's happening currently in Haiti, but also videos from people across the globe expressing solidarity with the Haitian people, and with our solidarity with the Haitian people and with getting the United States out of Haiti and toppling the Jovenel Moïse regime. And so I want to lift up specifically the U.S. out of Haiti aspect, because we often do not have an internationalist perspective, not necessarily our BPM audience, but in general, we often think that what's happening in Haiti or in Venezuela or in Iran or in China or in Senegal does not pertain to us, but it does, because U.S. imperialism is both a national and an international dynamic that's meant to basically crush us all. And so we very much need to support the Haitian people. We very much need to support our oppressed and neo-colonized brothers and sisters across the world, brothers, sisters, and siblings, because it is our duty and it is our historical task here. So again, you can visit that resource page on Black Alliance for Peace's website. You can check out Breakthrough News. You can check out Code Pink, and hopefully other of our comrades will drop their actions in the chat. And there's just been so much going on. I'm only scratching the surface of all of the things that have been happening since February, since early February. And we have people like Jamila Pierre, Mamira Prosper, and many, many others who have been lifting up this struggle in Haiti and who have been on various platforms, not least Renegade Culture, Voices with Vision, talking about what's going on. So follow this case, y'all. Follow this situation and spring into action. Do what you can. Join one of these protests or rally. Donate to the different organizations who are in solidarity with the Haitian people. But do something. Don't just sit idly, because this is vitally important, and it's our responsibility to take action. So that is my segment for Left Disquisition this week. All right, so on a more lighthearted notes, we are back with In These Tweets. It is just me and your boy Jab on the case. So what are you finding on my timeline and on the timelines of others, Jared?
So a couple of things, one of which from the Good Hood Communist crew that popped up on your timeline seems perfectly relevant. The people who are militant as fuck when it comes to calling out white supremacy, but completely uninterested in confronting the structures that give it power, capitalism and imperialism, end up causing a lot of confusion. I didn't plan it this way, but that seems to me, oddly part of a theme that has developed in at least this and several other of your shows here. But any elaboration or thought on that one?
Yeah, so this is basically a warning against the sort of both the race hustling and the identity reductionism that, our comrades at Hood Communists talk about. And so if you're only calling out white supremacy, but you're not calling out capitalism and you're not calling out imperialism, that is to say, if you don't have an internationalist or even a historical analysis, you cause confusion because you're making it seem as if there are not other dynamics at play. You don't pay attention to how I don't want to keep on picking on Tamika Mallory, but how the sort of activist aristocracy, so to speak, or the Black labor aristocracy or the niggerati, whatever you want to call it, how they're actually participating and reproducing these structures. And when you only focus on race and racism, you don't get, you're only analyzing that in a vacuum, so to speak, right? So white supremacy is only one of the many structures against which we need to struggle. And it's confusing for people who don't necessarily have any ideology, who don't have any political education. And then they think that this is the primary form of struggle when it's one of many. So that's what I take from this post. And I think it's really, really important in this moment, not least, thinking about what's happening with the Asian American community as well. Like, we need to think about not just, for example, not just, quote, stop Asian hate, but also stop the slander of China, right? Stop the slander of the DPRK, stop the ways in, we need to stop buying into the mainstream media's narrations in particular of the Asian and Pacific countries for their own imperialist aim. So I think that that's also part of what's being called out here.
Right on, right on. So this next one, I'm just going to present as you did. That is, as you posted without comment.
I have no comment. Next tweet. No, this, the rise continues. With Kendi, it seemingly came out of nowhere. One might argue it is seemingly going nowhere. I don't know. But it's I posted it without comment, but there are many, many comments underneath that I think convey various aspects of what might be said. But I mean, it's the anti-racism industrial complex that is ascending rapidly, I think, gives me pause about, the future of Black studies, about the ways in which we are allowing everything to become a brand and a commodity, about the individualization of structural problems, about the dearth of class and anti-capitalist analysis. And again, if we only have a racial analysis, if we only critique white supremacy, returning to the last tweet, then we completely evade what's going on with situations like this. And even going back to the conversation we were having about Ras Baraka's perspective, this is why I think that when we just close ranks and we only think about having a quote unquote united front, there are particular issues that will slip through the cracks. And I think we can ill afford to let those issues slip through the cracks. So it's my diplomatic reading of it.
Diplomatic reading and our attempt to avoid the slippage. I selected this one because there was an interesting, I think, set of criticisms from this interview that I did with Noura Erakat that I think are legit, that you and several others of our viewers raised regarding, for instance, her comments about, for instance, saying that the Palestinian situation is worse than South African apartheid. Drew some responses that I got, and her position on electoral politics and supporting the so-called lesser of evils. So I just thought I would raise this and I don't know, invite any further elaboration on that as well, because I thought that those were legit critiques that you and others shared.
Yeah, I just, want to lift up Erica Kane, as I always do. I feel like it's I need to just have my Erica Kane segment on each show. But, she called out, Noura's position in a different webinar about the Democrats basically being better than the Republicans and the lesser of two evilism. And Erica asked her if she still believed that. And she did. And she offered up her perspective, and that was that. I think that we can talk about different regimes of apartheid without having to make one worse than the other. We can talk about the different ways in which they manifest in different, in different settler colonial societies. And so I just, the Sharpeville massacre was deadly and violent as anything else that's happened in world history, for example. And so I'm hostile to those types of better or worse comparisons.
Yeah, I would have liked, in the moment, looking back as the interviewer, to have said a word or two about that, to not have just let that go. Sometimes I err on that side. sometimes I err on the side of playing host, and but that's why we operate. I look to operate in collectives so we can get these things caught when necessary.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I want to just lift
Mhm.
up about that is just your lives broadly. Like you host some really interesting, I think, and important conversations, and so people should definitely tap in. And you do stay attuned to what's happening in the chat. So tap into the I Mix What I Like lives. They're always good. Some better than others, but
Yeah.
And you're much more wide ranging than I am. I only want Black radicals on my shit. Like you talk to all sorts of people, so I think that's good as well.
Right on. And I like that you only want to talk to Black radicals. That's
Period.
So I liked, speaking of which, I liked what I found here or saw here on this tweet, where you're saying this is amazing, and you're referring to the LTP papers, which are, of course, something you will elaborate on for us, because I don't recall exactly what they are, but you're responding to the Sojourners for Truth and Justice were having a meeting about 5 blocks away. I think the evening I was born, he says, Keith Gilliard says, I think Charlotta Bass was chairing that meeting. I have the minutes somewhere. And you wanted to endeavor to see those minutes, which I think would be an exciting bit of research too. So, but what are the LTP papers, first of all, and then really what I wanted to ask about is sort of just the geeky side of research, and when you find gems like that to meetings, to minutes to meetings and stuff like that. So anyway, if you could just please elaborate a little bit.
Well, the LTP papers are the Louise Thompson Patterson papers. They're at Emory. And Keith Gilliard, he wrote a book on Louise Thompson Patterson that I actually reviewed for the African American Intellectual History Society. And so it was interesting we correspond on Twitter here and there. So, so he was saying that there's a whole folder on Sojourners for Truth and Justice, which I think I knew, because if you look at the footnotes of like Eric McDuffie's work and others, like there's, the locations of the documents. And so I was just asking him if those particular minutes were in the Louise Thompson Patterson papers, because they're there's documents on things spread out everywhere, right? So, for example, some of the stuff I found on the Sojourners for Truth and Justice for myself are in FBI files, because they have files of like a bunch of their pamphlets and etc. And so but something else that I do is that I be emailing people for their documents. Like if they already went and they digitize and they scan them, I'll ask them. So for example, Jodi and I are finishing up our volume on Black communist women, Organized Fight Win. And I emailed a bunch of people. Like I emailed John Monroe and Eric Gelman and Melissa Ford and Minka Makalani for a bunch of stuff to see if they actually had the copies of things that we were looking for. So we're looking for example, a speech for the Southern Negro Youth Congress. We were looking for some stuff from Williana Burroughs. And I know, because I know that these people write about them and I look at their footnotes, I know that they have them. And so if I can't go to the archive myself, especially now because they're closed, I also just reach out to people and ask them. And the worst they could say is no. Some people share their documents. Some people absolutely don't, which is fine. I just take note of that. I'm just kidding.
They go on the list.
The blacklist. So that's what that was about. That tweet.
When during your last episode conversation with Dr. Strong, there were some comments that admittedly I think are kind of funny, and given that anyway, and so when you brought up you were talking with Dr. Strong about Shaun King, some of our commenters got pretty funny in the chat, and I know that it's not so much that I want to advocate name calling and all of that, but I do acknowledge some of the humor in this. So, I thought to share it. Obviously it's like when Rad Reeds refers to him as Martin Luther Cream.
That's a good one. I've heard Talcum X,
absolutely, and that was certainly one of them. But the Martin Luther Cream I had not heard, and then the other one from the good David Silberg, Cloakley Carmichael, which I thought was also pretty good as well. So I just wanted to raise those up. I just wanted to shout out some of the folks in the chat and the comments. They get pretty funny with the puns.
Especially David and his wife. David and his wife got all the puns.
They are elite levels.
His wife really showed out at our Black Radical brunch, another one of which, by the way, is in the works. But but yeah, but David always has the hilarious puns. Some of them are corny, but that's okay. But I would say 85 to 90% are hilarious.
He's got a pretty good hit rate for sure. Right on. Shout out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Period.
So I just wanted to, I didn't forgive me for everybody for dragging us to the lower levels of our, socialization. But to wrap up, I do want to take us back to the top, given where you've taken us so far on this episode, and the commemoration of the late great Walter Rodney. I thought this tweet said just so much about why I have always appreciated Rodney and want to raise to the level of a Rodneyist myself, and speaks to a lot of some of what we've been talking about here in many different ways. But anyway, where he said that I trust that my use of words such as capitalism, imperialism, and neocolonialism will not be deemed as a cover for sinister intent. And then you include the rest of the quote, and I think you even allude to that same logic earlier in your discussion of Rodney with all of the descriptions of excrement and so on and so forth. But anyway, please elaborate as much as you like on this. I just thought I just love that he had said this, and I love that it's there for us to be reminded of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, I just like to lift up Dr. Rodney's words. But interestingly, this quote was in a document, a Walter Rodney birthday document that was shared by people who are on the advisory board for the Walter Rodney Foundation. So Mama Patricia Rodney, it was either Patricia Rodney or Asha posted this, and this was one of the things that was in that chat. But there was a whole bunch of information about him in there, like, he loved to play chess, he was always on time. Of the two, he was like the Patricia Rodney was the disciplinarian of the family. You know what I mean? It also to me alludes to intellectual McCarthyism or this anti-communism, because he says that because when he says, like, I hope that these words will not be deemed a cover for sinister intent, he's basically saying he could be red baited for using those, right? That this can be construed as being part of a socialist or communist cabal that would undermine the ways in which he's calling out the barbaric and inhumane practices of colonialism and imperialism. And so I love courageous people. Like, I love Thomas Sankara, I love Maurice Bishop, I love Vicky Garvin, I love Queen Mother Moore. I love all these people because I just think that being courage and being clear and forthright in your analysis is it's a skill. And something that we can be lacking these days with all of the, the double speak and, fear of being called out or canceled or whatever. I just wanted to share that quote with the world.
And I'm glad you did. And you talk about clarity. It ends with him saying that for this revolution here is aimed at destroying that monstrous system and replacing it with a just socialist society. So that's a pretty sharp level of clarity for one quick tweet and comment. So thanks for that. The tweets are always enlightening and engaging and copious. So
man, I was looking at, I have like 11,000 tweets, and I've been on Twitter less than a year. I need to get a life. It's a lot. It's a lot of tweets. No.
But again, as we said before, there's a lot of quality in that quantity. So
thank you. Okay, y'all, another quick segment of what I'm on. And I just essentially want to reference a workshop that I did on 3/19/21, March 19th, with 3 professors from Northwestern. And essentially what we workshopped was I sent them my proposal, the external reviewer comments in my proposal, and then my response letter. So once you get, comments from external reviewers, you have to respond. And I just essentially wanted to workshop that letter with professors. Number one, to make sure I addressed what needed to be addressed in the comments, and also, to make sure it didn't come off as defensive or as, and that it was thorough. And so they thought that was fine. And so they themselves raised a number of sort of interesting points of clarification, drawing from the proposal, and just from further conversation that came out of the response letter. So one thing, they told me to attend to was the sort of the ebbs and flows of the processes that I'm paying attention to. And so basically how I'm presenting it now is a sort of continuous narrative of anti-communist and anti-Black repression, which more or less is kind of how I see it, but also thinking about the ways in which it waxes and wanes, right? That it's not a sort of necessarily a steady flow, but that there are that it's a dynamic process, and to really pull that out. Another question was, where do we place Asian or Indigenous people or other people? And I said, it's a story about Blackness, period. But, part of what they recommended is the sort of, when I'm thinking about the international situation that's happening in my story, to also look at what my people are talking about. So certainly they're talking about, revolutions and rebellions and labor regimes that are happening elsewhere. So in Asia, for example. And so to it's not that I need to try to shove in all of these other concerns into a story that's effectively about Blackness, but rather draw on my thinkers to see how they're putting it in conversation with Blackness. And I thought that was useful. Because I can get a little bit defensive about, I feel like sometimes when we talk about Blackness or Black struggles, like we are compelled, or people will encourage us to talk about all sorts of other things in a comparative way, but I don't do comparative ethnic studies. I do Black studies. And so I can dig my heels in a little bit, but I think that to their point, it is important to mention other things that are happening. One of the questions that came out in the external reviews was, why am I using this term capitalist racism instead of racial capitalism? And I have a number of reasons for why I'm doing that. And so I asked, so basically the external reviewer said they did not find it compelling, that I should just simply wade into the debate and offer my own definition or my own approach to racial capitalism, which is actually what I've done. And I did that in a monthly review article. I also did it in an article that is out in Small Acts that was sort of a review of Peter James Hudson's book, Making an Empire. So, the people in the workshop, the three professors in the workshop said, they didn't have a perspective one way or the other on whether to use racial capitalism or capitalist racism, but definitely to just justify why it is that I'm using it. Especially in that can be a sort of a prefatory note that can be in the preface to put up a sort of not necessarily both a defense and a sort of explication of why it is that capitalist racism is an important innovation in this discourse. Because it's not, so for example, Michael Dawson uses race and capitalism as opposed to racial capitalism. There's also racialized capitalism that I think Nancy Fraser uses. There's racist capitalism. There's all these different sort of nomenclatures, many of which are sort of ill-defined in my perspective, but I think, but it's all fine, right? And I think that as long as, to the point of the professors who are in the workshop, as long as I have my own definition and my own rationale, then, it's all good. Another question that came up is like, why am I specifically using Black communists as opposed to like maybe, Black people in the Socialist Workers Party or Black anarchists or whatever, and to make that explicit. They also had me sort of it was kind of like a qualifying exam defense a little bit, whatever, but defend why it is that I'm pulling on this particular archive. And so, of course, I know why I'm doing it. And so they just were saying, make that explicit in terms of why it is that this archive has been ignored, or these thinkers have been ignored or have been sort of downplayed, and why it is that I'm trying to resuscitate that particular voice. So again, just drawing it out more and making sure to be explicit about it. The other thing that they wanted me to focus on, and that I think is really important to my narrative in particular ways too, is inaccuracy and sloppiness of state violence and of surveillance. Like, so for example, the FBI files, they'll be getting all kinds of shit wrong. They'll be mixing people up because, for them, all Black people look the same, that sort of thing. And like, does that undermine this idea of the sort of violence of state repression, since it was kind of like, sometimes it was just downright clownish? And I said, no, because when it comes to Black people or Blackness, it doesn't matter. You don't really have to be accurate, because if you get one Black person, that's as good as getting another Black person. We actually see this play out in real time, in that it's not about accuracy for real. It's because mythology about Black people is as good as fact about Black people. And this is why people like W.E.B. Du Bois were calling for a rigorous social scientific study of Black folks, because white folks would just put their perspective or their beliefs or mythology about Black people on wax, and that's just what it would be. And so likewise, the state, it's all about their anxieties and their fears and the ways in which they have a monopoly on violence to act upon those anxieties and fears that is constitutive of anti-Blackness. It's not whether or not they got information right. And so all of that to say, and also it's the same with communists too, right? They begin all sorts of stuff wrong, but to bear that out, that the state is just doing shit, but it's effective because they have the power and the resources to crush people. And then another issue that they raised was sort of the racialization of communism, which in my perspective comes after my story. So my story ends around 1954, and the racialization of communism, in my perspective, really aligns kind of with the Cuban Revolution on the one hand, but also the Sino-Soviet split. And so obviously the Chinese Revolution was prior to the Cuban Revolution, but there's a way in which in that sort of late 1950s and 1960s moment, especially with the Bandung Conference, et cetera, that the locus of struggle really moves to the global South in terms of socialist revolution and in terms of thinking about where the communist movement is. And so that's after my story, but part of a way to think about that in my moment is how, again, African American or Black communists are really targeted because of the ways in which there's a state anxiety about how communism and socialism and radicalism will rile up the Blacks, right? That there's something particularly dangerous about Black communists and socialists. And so thinking about the racialization of communism in that way. So I thought the conversation was really great. I thought that there were a lot of interesting conversations and things for me to think about. Of course, there are some things that I reject and that I'm like, okay, I'm not doing that shit. But that's me, and that's just the nature of the beast. And so, I'm finding some of these conversations to be really useful. But I also am getting to the point where I just need to stop having workshops and conversations and just actually finish a full draft of the manuscript, because talking about it over and over can sort of release some of the energy that needs to go towards writing. And it can sort of, when you're talking about it all the time or you're thinking about it all the time, it can feel like you're doing the work, but you're actually not doing the work. And so I'm sort of probably at that point. I think I have one more workshop scheduled. And mind you, that's the other thing. I scheduled all these workshops in like October and November as people were inviting me. And I thought I would have, I thought I would be further along in writing the manuscript. And so anyway, all of that to say, the workshop was great. I enjoyed the conversations and the feedback. And, I feel much more rooted in the manuscript than, even from episode 1, I was really in kind of struggle mode and just trying to get reacquainted with the book. And now I feel like I'm ovaries deep in it and I'm just, just plowing forward. All right, Jared, do you have any closing thoughts on the episode?
Of course. And as usual, it starts with the fact that, again, yet another banger episode. Congratulations. Great work.
Thank you.
And I also I hope other people appreciate this as much as I do, but I really think that your segments on your writing process are as interesting and revealing as any of the, more deeper theoretical historical work you do. So anyway, it's incredibly helpful, and I hope those particularly who haven't begun their publishing pay attention. Yeah, great job. Another great episode.
And the other thing that I just want to say in relation to that is track your process, monitor your process so that you can replicate it later, and also so you are not just doing shit. So process is important. It's almost as important as the content. Anyway, what else?
No, that's it. I mean, another great show. We covered a lot. You covered a lot, and it was great to watch and somewhat participate in. And so, again, congratulations on another dope episode.
Yeah, and thank you for your contributions. You're a great producer. So, all right, y'all, that's our show for this Friday evening. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with me. I am Dr. CBS. That is Dr. Jab, and we are signing off.